one of the most interesting public figures and intellectuals to arise over the last several years has been Jordan B. Peterson, who's a Canadian psychologist, and he's done a lot of work in public lecturing on religious mythology and symbolism and how that relates to a psychological kind of model of the universe, as well as he's been outspoken on a number of cultural issues as well. But he did this interview with Kurt Mungel, who is a physicist, and he hosts a podcast called Theories of Everything. In the interview, it was called God, Consciousness, and Theories of Everything. And he said this really interesting thing, which ties in with the notion of self and what it ought and needs to be in psychology and the symbolism of that. So the self is the thing that remains constant across transformations and guides them, and then that Christ, mythologically or psychologically speaking, is then the symbol of the self, and the self is the thing that's underneath the continual transformations which unites them, and even more importantly, it's the thing that gives us the intuitions that guides those transformations towards a higher order form of unity and completion. And this is the crucial insight, and I don't know if he realizes this, but this is the crucial insight to unite metaphysics with psychology, which is the purpose of this series, Psychologos, to unite psychology, our own internal private lives, with the logos, the order of the universe. So there's a classic challenge to God's omnipotence. It's could God create a rock that he couldn't lift? And in the CTMU, in the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, the answer is yes, but it's a constraint set by God himself, because God can put that constraint on himself. And in some sense, creation is God's self-restraint into a more distilled version of himself, which can then become a semi-separate entity. We did a video on that called Panentheism and Apologia. I did two, actually. So God is the I am in the Bible, the self-defining, self-subsisting one. And the story of this is told regardless of whether you believe there was a historical representation of this. It doesn't really matter, but at least mythologically and psychologically speaking, this story is told in the story of Christ. So he, as God, and Christ represents the self, is what you have to remember throughout this. So he, as God, as that which retains God's essence in the world, as the Logos made flesh, as the way, the truth, the life, adopts the maximum degree of responsibility. And this is crucial to Peterson's psychometaphysic, is that meaning it comes from the maximal degree of responsibility, and that's symbolized by Jesus, because Jesus adopts the maximum degree of responsibility of being tortured and humiliated and murdered and crucified for the spiritual betterment of mankind. But the interesting thing about this story, and this is something Slavoj Žižek points out, is that he can hardly bear that suffering. So he cries out to God, he says, my God, Eli, Eli, why hast thou forsaken me? And what Slavoj Žižek said about this in his debate with Peterson, which was ostensibly about communism but got into a number of very interesting topics, is that the conditions of human existence are so tragic that even God himself in human form lost faith for a moment in the goodness of being. So the unliftable rock, in a sense, is the redemption of mankind. The answer to the problem of omnipotence and the problem of the fallen world, that there is evil and sin and destruction and death, are intertwined. And the cross is the symbol of the transcendence of those. So this is an idea from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's wonderful book called God in Search of Man, A Philosophy of Judaism, that the story told by the prophets, the message underlying the Hebrew Bible, and for that matter, human history, is that we are partners in creation to forge a world filled with justice and compassion, to the degree, and that we are the partners with God to the degree that we can retain God's essence of our own free will despite the malevolence and the suffering of the world. The integrated model of self, which Peterson the Peterson/Jungian model of integrated self, which Peterson talks about in his podcast with Joe Rogan, which Greg Wilford reiterated in his conversation with yours truly, I'll link that in the description as well, is that is that you should learn to be a monster, an absolute monster, that you should be strong, that you shouldn't be weak, you should be strong and forceful, and then you should learn how to control it. So we have this capacity for evil, but we keep it sheathed. The Peterson's definition of the meek is those who keep their swords sheathed, and this is a point from Heather Haying, an evolutionary biologist. She wrote a book called the Evolution's Guide to the 21st Century or something. I don't recall, but what she says is that alpha males aren't tyrants or brutes as they're kind of popularly conceived of, but they're actually peacemakers. So you have to be strong, you have to be forceful, you have to be an absolute monster, and then you learn how to control it. And Jesus is kind of the prime example of this because he has this enormous, he has this godlike power, but still prays for his enemies and those who persecute him. So you have the capacity for evil, but you keep it sheathed, and you do good in this world, and you do it under the authority of God, and that's the model of the self, and that's the divine symbol of the self in proper relation to God. Tyler Goldstein, who has this channel called Theories of Everyone, and is the author of Sentient Singularity Theory, and I wanted to have him on soon, but he says about the story of Jesus that essentially you have to give everything for everyone in order to be everything for everyone. So there's this idea from Bishop Robert Barron, he talked about in his podcast with Cosmic Skeptic, is that the seat of conscience in the soul is that the voice of conscience is the vicar of Christ, is the substitute for Christ, the substitute for God, and that's actually guiding your continual transformation. So the perfect, and every ideal is a judge, so the perfect archetype of what we ought to be is constantly guiding our transformations. Chris Langan says about Jesus that he's a man-shaped gateway to salvation, that you have to mold yourself into that essence, which is calling you forth, and there are analogs of this in other religions as well. As reading the Bhagavad Gita recently. I don't recall who it was, but there's this guy, he's kind of like the perfect man, and that's actually how the world is created in Hindu mythology. So the question, like, what would Jesus do, which came around in the 80s and is kind of a cheeky, American Protestant slogan, but it takes on metaphysical and psychological significance because it's the same question as what ought I to do if I were the fully actualized version of myself, which is or ought to be, I think, the fundamental question in psychology. So people often ask Peterson whether he believes in God because of a lot of his work centers on the interpretation of religious mythology and support for the Judeo-Christian civilization and way of thinking, which has built up our world over the last millennia. And he gives a definition on Kurt Jaimungal's podcast of what God is, which ties into the Jungian definition of the self, that God is the spirit that guides our sequential transformations upward to a higher and higher degree of unity and maybe a higher and higher form of delight and love. So it's that which is calling us higher. And you can think about that in terms of, in a psychological way, that there's this force of gravity that's pulling us down to the Earth's mass, and we actually know that this is a product of the fabric of reality. It's in general relativity, and in the CTMU, it's the constantive manifold. It's that all of mass is attracted to its center. So we're stuck on the ground, but then the highest and loftiest values are up at the top of the pyramid. So it's what's calling us up away from the dirty and filthy ground and to the highest of heavens. So, and it's guiding our sequential transformations towards that. And you can also think of that as, if you take every righteous person and abstract out the patterns, what is at the top? And that's God in Peterson's metaphysic. And while this is psychologically pretty much absolutely true, I think it falls short in the metaphysical domain, but not because it goes too far, but because it doesn't go far enough. So what you need to say to have a definition of God which suits the metaphysical, psychological, and mythological domains, say that the spirit which compels us to imitation, which guides our transformations towards a higher and higher form of unity and delight and love, is the creator and king of the universe in his ultimate reality subsisting in itself. Because if you don't actually say that that's true, then you're saying that we're basically just making this construct up, and that's not really enough. And you're saying, all of the wise men of old are really just fools, and they were, making these stories to fool themselves into. There's a pragmatic element because you can still have that story to guide you, but you have to sit, and there's more advanced justification for this in other parts of my channel on why God is a metaphysical necessity. But you need to say that is actually true, that creator and king of the universe is that which guides us forward, and that is the fundamental axiom of what I'll call metapsychology or psychologos. So that our internal private lives and the symbols associated with the ethos of our cultures and stories passed down from generation to generation, mythology, scripture, etc., in some cases for thousands of years, are actually intimations of the ultimate reality. We're not fooling ourselves. So again, I said there's this idea that the conscience is the vicar. It's the stand-in for God, the stand-in for Christ in the soul. And this is a very kind of Protestant idea, even though I said it was shared by Bishop Robert Barron, who's, of course, a Catholic, but that the spirit which compels us to imitation is our own personal pope, is the seat of God in our soul. The intermediary between us and God is our conscience, which you can think of that, which is guiding us to moral and truthful action. And that holds, he claims, regardless of whether one even believes in God or a transcendent moral order. That if you're acting according to your conscience, that you're making good moral decisions, you are playing the role that you're created for, and you can be rewarded for that in the hereafter, regardless of your personal beliefs, or at least what you claim your personal beliefs are. And so the ensemble of questions, and Peterson also brings up this point, it's like the ensemble of questions, is God good, is God loving, is God faithful, is God beautiful, can all be reversed to say, is good God, is love God, is faithfulness God, is beauty God. So what you're really doing when you're saying that God is real is saying also real is God, that reality is that which, and thus real is also good, and real is beautiful, and real is faithful, and real is beautiful. And so you're saying that real is God, and that the ultimate reality, that which creates and permeates every aspect of existence, is that which defines and unites our moral perceptions and allows for morality and ethical living. And so that becomes the fundamental axiom of the universe of God as that which unites all of our moral perceptions. And so in Peterson's first debate with Sam Harris, he actually powerfully argues that our moral systems have to be based off something transcendent, that morality is a fundamentally religious instinct. And I think I agree with this, that our morality is our beingness in relation to the vicar of God in our soul. And this is what ultimately compelled Immanuel Kant to believe in God, despite he had every rational argument against it. He famously disputed the ontological, teleological, and first cause argument for God. But the morality argument is ultimately what compelled him to believe in God, that our experience of the moral aspect of existence is more fundamental than our experience of the material aspect of our existence. And this needs to be the fundamental axiom of our psychological understanding in relationship to the Logos, the transcendent order of the universe. It's almost like the transcendent moral order is a self-fulfilling belief. You're contributing to its existence by moral action, by listening to the voice crying out in the wilderness, like Isaiah said, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So our response to God's call, is the adventure and purpose of our lives, and it's that which brings light to a world so dark and gloomy that sometimes, that one time, even God himself couldn't bear it. And so I say to you, let the light shine forth in the darkness, the level in the wilderness, a highway for our God, and may the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. I can subscribe. Peace.